Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good night, whichever the case may be, where you are. This is Dr. Stringer, and I am coming back to you this week with the discussion of the police use of force. This is a little picture from your textbook, and their main idea here is that, when you look at the police use of force, regardless of whether it's justified or not, it never really photographs that well. Um, And so that's something to think about when you see this. Even if someone is shooting at the police officer and they're shooting back, they still kill the person, and so that's very unfortunate. Um, just a few things that I want to go through for the use of force discussion. Um, so first, a little bit of case law, and this is Graham versus Connor, going all the way back to 1989. And some of you probably were not even born yet. I believe in '89 I would have been about 7 years old, telling of my age a little bit there. But Graham versus Connor says that force must be objectively reasonable in the view of all of the facts and circumstances. And we generally say that the police are to use the minimum amount of force necessary in order to, accomplish their goal, to effect an arrest or to protect themselves or others from harm. So some of you maybe have heard of something called the continuum of force, or the use of force continuum, similar terminology, right? And this is a stepwise progression where officers use the next severe form of force only if the previous form of force did not induce subject compliance. So if maybe you're trying to handcuff someone and they don't, comply, maybe you might tase them or pepper spray them or something like that, and to get them to comply. And so here is a basic example, again from your textbook, of this continuum of force, with just the officer presence being at one extreme over here, and then deadly force being all the way at the other extreme. And in the middle, you have, verbal commands, control talk, hands-on techniques. You might use bodily force if that doesn't work. And then you'd have your impact weapons, your batons, your tasers, your OC sprays, and things like that. And then deadly force is pretty self-explanatory. So obviously you should be trying to use just officer presence to get people to comply, or verbal commands. And most people will comply with just verbal commands. It is unfortunate that some, don't comply with verbal commands, and this requires an escalation of the use of force continuum, because some people don't really like being arrested and things like that. So one of the limitations of the reasonable use of force, or the use of force guidelines, is that agencies often don't incorporate the level of citizen resistance. And so this is an interesting topic, and here's just a little table that goes through subject or citizen resistance. And so no resistance. If they're not resisting at all, then the appropriate use of force would be officer presence. All right. If they're just verbally resisting, then maybe you might use some verbal commands and things like that. Passive resistance. Passive resistance is a little bit different. It's when someone's not really attacking the police officer, but maybe they're just going limp and they won't move or something like that. That's being more passively resistant. An example of that is sometimes we would take my wife's cat outside, and we'd put her on a leash and try to walk her in the front yard and things like that. And she did not like that. And so she would just kind of go limp and just lay there on the ground. And we couldn't get her back in the house or anything. And it was essentially, we could either pull her across the yard or pick her up and carry her. She was just not going to walk in the yard. And so she was being passively resistant. So defensive resistance, that's when they're actively, defending themselves from, you trying to put the handcuffs on them or something like that. And then aggressive resistance, obviously, attacking the police officer or something like that. And then deadly resistance, obviously, is trying to stab or shoot the police officer or something like that. And this talks about how, passive resistance, you might use some hands-on techniques, verbal commands, control talk, but you wouldn't really use many of your weapons on the bat belt, so to speak. And then obviously, as a subject becomes more resistant, then you would use these, intensified techniques going further up the use of force continuum. So here's just definitions of subject resistance that I kind of already went over. Efforts to unresponsive is passive. Efforts to evade, fleeing, resisting, things like that, and then attacking, preparing to fight the officer or striking the officer would be aggressive resistance. Attempting or actual attacks on the officer or another citizen that could cause death. So these are all things to think about. So police officers, when they're interacting with the public, are often conducting a threat assessment when they interact with a new person. They make a new traffic stop or something like that. They're making this assessment. Okay, well, what's the age of this person? What's their size? Skill level's a little bit harder to figure out, unless they're wearing a Navy SEAL uniform or something. The availability of backup, the degree of stabilization, a lot of issues that come across nowadays with police use of force and people battling, the police is a mental health issue to some extent, and people are being, some people have mental instability, and so that's something to think about, because when people are unstable, either mentally or due to some sort of intoxicant, maybe they've been taking meth or PCP or something like that, they tend to be very erratic, things like that. Whether this person has a weapon. A few, classes ago when I was teaching this face-to-face, we were using the example, and I was trying to think of somebody that was just a huge, massive person against, a small, one of the girls in the class as the police officer. And the student said, "What about Shaq?" And I said, "Yeah, Shaq is a great example. If you have Shaq and he's really angry, he would be a significant threat to pretty much anybody, especially, a smaller 120-pound, 5'2" female officer. And so then she would take that into account and say, well, so then she would be justified in using a little bit more force if Shaq was, decided that he didn't want to be arrested or whatever. She probably wouldn't try to wrestle Shaq or use kind of hands-on techniques. It might just be that, you're going to just go right to tasing him or something like that. The availability of backup is an important one too, because there's many police officers that, especially in a rural area, where if you have one person there, or maybe there's a whole lot of people in a car and you're just the one officer there, that could be a problem, and things could go south really, really quickly. And also think about, and I don't think your textbook talks about this, but these are things that go into this, and I like to add my 2 cents here or there in case y'all haven't picked up on that. But suspect demeanor. And demeanor goes into, the degree of stabilization. People will sometimes become violent and aggressive, and they'll be acting that way before they start actively attacking a police officer. So that tends to go into that threat assessment. The offense that you're investigating them for, that can matter to some extent. If you're, you're conducting a felony stops for someone who's just been suspected of shooting up a school or something like that, obviously this person is much more of a threat than a little old lady that, can barely see over the steering wheel. Although that little old lady could shoot you too, so you should not be, misled by that. And that has happened sometimes. Prior history. If you have prior history with a suspect and he's known for being violent. In many departments, you deal with the same people over and over again, and so there are some people that just have a tendency for being combative towards the police whenever they interact with them. Um, and so, that's something to think about when you're conducting a threat assessment of what the problem is. So when I teach this class face to face, we do this cool, the students seem to really like it, simulation of the 21-foot rule, where I bring in a belt with a holster and a fake plastic training gun, and we get a fake plastic knife and stuff, and then measure out 21 feet, and students take turns to see who can run and get to the person posing as the officer before they can get their weapon out and shoot them. Sometimes I throw in different scenarios in there too to say, okay, well, we're going to have two people. You don't know which one has the knife, and we've had several students, fake shoot unarmed people and things like that. But anyway, the 21-foot rule essentially posits that a suspect with a knife who's within 21 feet can actually run at a police officer and stab them within the time that it takes the officer to unholster, draw, and aim their firearm and shoot. Officers will be particularly on guard of people within 20 feet or so. Obviously, there's some limitations to this, and it doesn't hold up all the time. It depends on the officer's holster, how experienced they are, how fast of a runner the person is, how close attention he's paying to the person, whether they realize that he has a knife as they start running, things like that can make a difference. So looking at deviations in the use of force and looking at the difference between excessive force and brutality. Excessive force, sometimes you might say, it could just be an honest mistake. Maybe you used a little bit more force than you should have, but usually this can be equated to a training problem, and you can usually get an officer trained a little bit better, and then they won't have that problem in the future, and it may possibly be a good faith mistake. On the other hand, when it comes to police brutality, good faith and mistakes play no role in this. Police brutality is a purposeful act. And that you can't train out of an officer that it's just a crime, and it very well should be. Committed by officers who usually take great pains to conceal their misconduct as well. And so there's some examples of that I'm sure you all have seen in the media over the past few years. And sometimes we watch these videos in class and things, and so I can't show them to you all now, but obviously I'm sure you've seen some of them. Anyway, so looking at the different types of use of force, I want to go through all of these, and just so you all know and you're clear. So verbal talk and commands. So there's a difference in this between talk and commands, right? So do you mind if I look around the car a little bit, like we talked about before? The officer might, talk to the person, and do you mind if I look around the car? That's what's known as search talk. You might also ask that or talk in that manner when you're trying to ask someone questions and find out what's going on. If an officer is very aggressive and kind of mean to people when they're trying to get them to cooperate, then people tend to just shut down, right? They're not going to be helpful. Then, there's persuasion. Sir, would you mind stepping over here? And then, you have your show me your hands. You're getting a little bit more aggressive there. And then you have your heavy control talk, which is, you're essentially yelling at the person, you drop the knife or I'll shoot. You might use stun words, right? Freeze is a big one, right? Hands in the air. You hear phrases like that. And that's when things are getting, very, very intense, right? That's when you're usually getting to a point when you're almost to the point of using deadly force or using one of those higher up force levels. Um, Now, your book talks about using these stun words as being typically swear words. Um, I know your book says that it's one of those things that it might happen here and there, but I know there at least one instance that I can tell you all about where there was a police officer who was doing a stop, and he was a solo officer, and he had done a traffic stop. There was like four guys in the car, and so police officers usually tell people to stay in the car. They don't like it when you get out of the car. And the people started to get out of the car, and one police officer versus four suspects is a bit much, and so he's using kind of light control, telling them to get back in the car of the PA system, um, and that wasn't working. So he ended up using the F bomb, and he says, "Get the F, back in the car," and the people got back in the car, after he said that, Long story short, that officer actually ended up getting in trouble because they made a complaint against him for using the F word over the intercom on the police car. Um, and so, officers will tend to try not to do that because you can actually get in trouble for it. The officer was honest about it. He said, "Yes, I did, and I was, trying to prevent the situation from escalating. We had a lot of people in the car. I was there by myself. It's much easier to use, the stun words. But anyway, so he got written up, and he's told not to do that anymore. They said it was unprofessional. So that's why I say, swear words probably wouldn't be the go-to thing, because of that issue with professionalism there. So bodily force, takedowns. Bodily force is actually the most common type of force to be used. It's also the one, I think I mentioned this before, we're talking about health and safety, that is the one that's most likely to lead to injuries to both officers and suspects. And so, this involves punches, kicks, destabilization methods, to throw people off their feet and get them to the ground, such as takedowns, things like that. And these are all just empty hand maneuvers, right? So, moving along with types of use of force, there's this other idea that you all have probably seen to some extent in the media, and it's known as positional asphyxia. And we've known about this in the field of criminal justice for quite some time, this is essentially when someone is taken to the ground, they're handcuffed behind their backs, and they're left in that prone position with their face facing down, and this can actually cause problems with breathing because it doesn't allow, and maybe there's an officer on top of them or something like that, and it doesn't allow your chest to go up and down, so it kind of constricts everything, so it's very difficult to breathe, as you can imagine. And this is a big problem with that, and that's why police officers are trained. If you're holding someone on the ground like that, you do it very quickly. You hold them there long enough to get them handcuffed and get them secured, and then you either roll them on their side, sit them up, something like that. It is perfectly, as far as training, acceptable to put your knee on someone's back or something like that, or be on top of them to hold them down while you're trying to handcuff them, because if someone is fighting you, and you're trying to handcuff them, then, you have to find some way to keep them under control while you're getting the handcuffs on. But you should never be holding someone down there for an inordinate period of time. After the handcuffs are on and the person's already secured, you get them up, you either roll them on their side, sit them up, or put them, get them all the way up standing and walk onto the police car and get in the police car. There's some other factors that can actually make this worse. One is obesity. Those of us with a gut, as it constricts your stomach as well when you're in that position, it actually prevents your diaphragm from being able to expand and contract as well, which is another way that your chest can allow air to get in. Psychosis, pre-existing physical conditions, pressure on the abdomen, things like that, like people being on top of you. There's something else to think about. Nowadays, there's newer research coming out about excited delirium, which they haven't figured out exactly what causes it, but it's usually related to some sort of drug use, and then interaction with the police, and people are kind of hysteric, and then they end up dying in police custody, but they're not exactly sure what exactly causes this excited delirium. But the positional asphyxia has been around for quite some time, and of course you can read about that in your textbook there, and there's a little excerpt from that. So, deadly force. So obviously you all know what deadly force is, I'm sure. Um, Police officers, they have to protect their lives and the lives of others, and one of the things about use of force is it's almost necessary for police to be able to use force, not only to effect arrest, but people try to shoot and successfully shoot and kill police officers, so they should be allowed to defend themselves. It's unfortunate that force gets misused sometimes by some police officers, are kind of giving everybody a bad name. For those of you that don't know, Tennessee versus Garner outlawed shooting fleeing felons in 1985. And I usually talk about the case of Walter Scott when we talk about this in class. Walter Scott was not a fleeing felon, however, he was fleeing, in case you saw the video. And so, it used to be before 1985, if someone was, on a chain gang, or, they were in prison, they were a convicted felon, and they were trying to flee the prison, particularly in the South, then the COs could shoot them in the back as they were running away. If it was a convicted felon prisoner trying to run away, and that's if you've probably seen the old movies, the guards would have guns, and but Tennessee versus Garner said you can't do that unless the person is in imminent danger, like a fleeing felon with a gun that's running into a house full of kids or something like that, and that they're violent and they might shoot and kill those kids, then that's the only situation you can do that. Obviously, with the Walter Scott case, that's not the case, and he did not have a gun or taser or any kind of weapon at all. He was just trying to run away, proper protocol would have been for that officer to just chase after him. Some of you that have seen the video probably saw that officer didn't apparently know that he was being recorded, because then he tried to take the taser and then go put it next to Walter Scott after he was already on the ground, which really put the nails in that officer's coffin, so to speak, for his trial. Anyway, but even if he hadn't have done that and it had been videotaped, there was still no justification for that. There was no imminent danger. Ballistic evidence would have shown that Walter Scott was shot in the back, and he would have had to justify why he shot the guy in the back. And I don't know that he would have been able to come up with anything, even if he had a taser. So anyway, moving along. So one of the problems with use of force is that there's no federal database. There's no whole database for the entire country for police officers. The Justice Department, is working on trying to put that together. I think it would be a great thing to have. I look forward to using it because I think, we can do a lot with data and really figure out who the problem officers are and help to weed out some of those things. The Washington Post in 2015 actually started putting together some use of force data, but I believe it's only deadly force. So that's an interesting source if any of you are doing papers on that or something. Anyway, one thing that I wanted to at least bring up when it comes to deadly force is training. For those of you that don't know, police officers, like the military, are taught to shoot for center mass. So, that is the biggest area of a body of a person to hit, um, and so that's what they're trained to shoot at. There is actually something that some of you may or may not know of called the failure drill, which is where after shots to center mass don't stop a suspect, they try to take a headshot, and that's been used successfully because, if you all don't know, there's sometimes when you can have someone shooting at you, and you can land a couple of chest shots to center mass, and they're still coming at you and still firing at you. Really, unless you hit them right in the heart, that's not going to, have an instant, takedown, so to speak. But usually, if you hit someone in the head, their brain is a pretty important part of things moving along, and so they'll do that, and that's called the failure drill. So typically, center mass, you have the failure drill in that instance, and there's been a couple of instances where that's actually saved a couple of officers' lives. Because the suspect had been shot a couple of times in center mass, and they still continued to run towards them and shoot at that officer. So anyway, but oftentimes in the media you hear things about why didn't this officer shoot the person in the leg or the hand, things like that. Officers are not trained to do that. I mean, you look at my hand. Imagine I'm moving my hands and my legs. To invite some of you to go to a shooting range and try to hit a moving target that is the size of someone's hand and see how challenging that can be. And keep in mind that as you're trying to hit this person's leg or hand, they're actively trying to attack you. So you don't have time to sit there and try to hit them in the leg and the hand as they're running and moving and all these other things because your life is at stake, or the lives of others. Police officers are not taught to shoot warning shots. Warning shots are actually against policy in pretty much every police department I've ever heard of. And for those of you that don't know, if you shoot a bullet up in the air, guess what? What goes up must come down. So those bullets come down somewhere. If you're shooting guns in the air, they can come down, miles away, and hit someone and kill them. I think that's actually happened before, not with police shooting in the air, but with, other civilians doing that. And it's just the person that it hit didn't even hear the shots because it was so far away that the actual gunfire was, and then the bullet just came down out of thin air, literally. Police officers are not trained to wrestle guns away from people or use martial arts against knives and things like that. One of the hardest things to defend against is actually a knife attack. You think about it, if someone has a knife and they're, especially a big knife, you can't really block it because then they're going to stab you in the arm or whatever, even in martial arts. For those of you that have any martial arts training, you'll know that, a knife is really hard to deal with because anything you put up to block it is you're risking getting an injury to that appendage. And so, but knives are considered to be lethal weapons. So the police don't, carry knives to fight against people with knives. They use guns for that. So that's the way the policy is. And so here's just an example of, New York City department policy on deadly force. And like I said, I don't know if y'all can see it when I use the arrow, but let me try the laser pointer. So police officers shall not fire warning shots. You can give verbal warnings, like, hey, stop now or I'm going to shoot. And most, departments do that, and most officers do. They don't discharge their firearms to summon assistance. A bunch of different criteria. You do not discharge firearms in defense of property. There's a bunch of, fleeing felons, things like that. Can't shoot dogs. You can go and read this yourself. Some of you, probably most of you are too young to know this, but this whole cocking a firearm, it used to be police officers carried a Beretta 92F, which was a double action, but you can actually pull the hammer back on the back of it, kind of like you would a revolver, and then it releases a little bit of the trigger tension, so you don't have to pull the trigger back, or the trigger distance, I guess. So you don't have to pull the trigger back as far when you fire it. But they said officers are not to do that because it makes it more likely it can go off by accident. And so they are to be double action at all times. Nowadays, most departments are using Glocks and Smith and Wessons and things like that, which don't have a hammer anyway, so this is not an issue. Those are all double action anyway. So just some characteristics of subjects and deadly force incidents. Subjects have fired shot, so threat posed by the subject. In 74% of cases, as of 2015, subjects have fired shots, brandished a gun, or attacked a person with his or her bare hands prior to being shot. You don't see deadly force being used all that often. Police officers usually only use it when they absolutely have to because they know they get in a lot of trouble. When you look at, race of subjects, gender, of course, we only have 4% of females because men are just more violent and tend to also be more criminal. You have 50% of white suspects. You got 26 black, you got Hispanic, other, and unknown in there as well. So looking at this is just a little bit of data from your textbook. Moving along to another type of force, which is known as OC spray. You might have heard of it as pepper spray. That's essentially the spray that they'll spray in people's eyes. This is actually available to the public. So you can buy it too, and it's used by about 94% of departments. A lot of officers carry it, and it can be used, to spray a suspect so that it irritates their eyes and things like that. But officers really don't like it that much nowadays, now that they have tasers. For one reason being, you can't use it in a confined area. Otherwise, it could get in your eyes as well and incapacitate you as well as the suspect. And so that's one reason they don't like it. And if it does get in your eyes, I always think it's interesting that if police officers spray someone with that, they'll rinse their eyes out with water when they get to the jail and things like that. And if you ever get OC spray in your eyes, do not put water in it. And I think this picture looks like, I can't tell what it says on that bottle there, but this looks like milk coming out of here. It's a white substance. If you ever get it in your eyes, you want to use milk. It's OC spray is based on a pepper, a really hot pepper. I can't remember how what pepper it is. But if you've ever eaten really hot chicken wings or really hot pepper or something like that, and you drink water, you know that really just kind of makes it worse. The only thing that can really fix it is milk. So if you ever get any of it in your eyes by accident or something like that, you want to try to rinse your eyes out with milk. Those of you who have prior military service probably know this from the tear gas hut and things like that. So milk can actually deactivate it, and that still even takes a little while. It can also impact your breathing and things like that. So the next type of force that the police have access to is what is known as a taser, and it's actually an acronym for Thomas A. Swift Electronic Rifle. And you can look up who Thomas A. Swift was if you're that interested in it. But essentially, for those of you that don't know, a taser will shoot out two probes that are then supposed to stick in a person and then deliver electricity to the body. And this essentially, because our muscles and everything are driven and are made move by electric impulses, this disrupts that, and so the person cannot move. Most, if not all departments I know of, if you carry a taser, you are required to be tased by that taser beforehand, and so before you're allowed or you're issued one. And so the officers know what this feels like. Now, they don't actually shoot them with the barbs. What they do is they just tape the probes onto their chest, because the barbs will actually leave, a wound, and they're kind of difficult to get out sometimes as well. So they'll tape them on there. And you can probably find videos of that. I know I've seen them before with different departments, when actually Kennesaw PD had one of their rookies, and they congratulating him on, you know, surviving taser training. Most officers that I know will tell you too that they'd rather be tased than have OC spray, because the taser, you get, one shot with the taser, and you're tense for 30 seconds through the cycle, and then it's over with. But the OC spray, it lasts for an hour or so. The effects of that. When the tasers first came out, they only had one shot in the cartridge. So this is the cartridge right here. But the newer ones, I believe, have two shots in them. I know at least the ones in Atlanta have two shots, and I think they might have a cartridge with three shots in it now too. But initially they just had one shot. So essentially, whatever model you have, you get the number of shots with this cartridge. And then once the cartridge is gone, you can't use it as a taser anymore, but you can still see these electrodes right here. You can still, if your cartridge is on and empty, you can still use it as a stun gun, which doesn't have quite the same effect. It's more of a pain compliance mechanism, but can still be used as that. People tend to lose control of different bodily functions if they get tased as well, and they can actually have problems if someone has a heart problem or something like that. That can actually cause them to die, because it's important to remember that tasers and even pepper spray and batons and things like that, they can still kill people. They're what's known as less lethal force. It's not that they're non-lethal, it's that they're less lethal. Years ago, when tasers first came out, they had an instance where someone actually caught on fire. They had been pepper sprayed, and then they were tased after that. And back then, there was something that with the aerosol and the pepper spray that they put in there to propel it, I believe, that was flammable. The officers didn't know this at the time, and it hasn't happened since. And since they've modified the ingredients of that, but that actually did happen. Oh, another interesting thing, we're talking about positional asphyxia. There have also been people who have been pepper sprayed in the past, who have then been put in the back of a police car facing down and things like that, and then passed away from that as well, because of the way that the pepper spray impacts, not just your eyes, but your breathing as well. So officers are trained to monitor people if they've been exposed to that, to make sure and be careful what position they're in the police car and things like that after the fact. Just another one of the side stories of all of this. Other types of use of force are batons. Batons are one of the oldest things that have been around. I got the link to the Rodney King baton beating. If anyone's interested in that, I'm sure you can Google it and find it. Rodney King was one of the first, issues with use of force in African Americans, and I'm quite sure that this has been going on for some time. But Rodney King, the beating was actually caught on video. I think it was the first, and now we have, videos all the time. And I always tell students, this is all coming to light now, but this has been going on for quite some time. And it's just now that we have videotape evidence that we're seeing it get a lot more attention. But anyway, so batons have been around, since before America was even a country. They used them in England, right? And so here's the regular old, you'll still see riots in riot gear. They might carry one of these. And this is a regular old wooden baton. For quite some time, this was popular. This is known as a PR-24, and it has this little side handle here. And this enabled officers to do a little bit more with it. It was actually modeled after a martial arts weapon known as the tonfa, and then you can Google that. It's Ton or Tofa or Tonfa. Yeah, sorry. Um, and martial artists would have two of them, and so they modeled it after that, thinking that they could train officers to use this in the same way that martial artists did. It didn't last all that long. You see them in the movies still, but they quickly found out that police officers, needed a lot more training to be able to use them effectively, and they take up a little bit of room. And they've really been traded in for these collapsible batons, which officers can keep right on their belt at all times. You all are probably too young to remember, but around the same time the PR-24 was popular, the big D-cell mag lights were also popular. They were the brightest flashlights you could get at the time, and they're also really big, so police officers would carry these at nighttime, and they would double not only as a source of light, but as a potential weapon or baton if they needed to use a baton. And so they would leave the PR-24 in the car and use the big mag light. Nowadays we have flashlights that are way smaller and way brighter than the biggest mag light is, so they just use those. And so one of the things in police training that officers would always be taught is to always hold your mag light up over your shoulder like this in your left hand if you're right-handed. And so that was so that if someone was to come at you, you have the light or the device already up. You don't have to lift it up to hit them with it. It's already up here, and it's also in your non-gun hand, so you can draw your weapon without having to move it. And that's one of the things that rookie police officers in training tend to struggle with, is remembering to keep their gun hand free. Just a little side note, I guess. Anyway, looking at the collapsible baton, they're typically called ASP batons, ASP, but that's just the brand name. There's other companies that make them now, and they collapse down to about the size of this, and then you go like that, and they extend out. Interestingly, though, I've never been a big fan of these. Well, it's nice that they're collapsible and all, but all the energy from this thing is focused on this little ball right here. So if you hit someone with any part of this other than this ball part, it's not really going to do very much. They don't have very much weight to them and things like that. They are very good at breaking windows, though. I've seen them effectively break some windows pretty good. If you hit them with that ball tip there on a car window, it'll break it pretty quickly. So I guess that is one good use, or one use of them that is effective. Anyway, so moving along to some officer characteristics and use of force. Just like we talked about, before with, corruptions and things like that, and crime, there's a small number of officers that are responsible for a large percentage of these incidents with use of force. And most police officers are not doing this. It's just like crime. Most citizens are law-abiding citizens. I don't know if I've told you all about the 80-20 rule, but I think that would probably apply to police use of force and brutality as well, is that 80% of the problems are caused by 20% of the population. And that applies to crime too. 80% of the crime is committed by 20% of the population or less. So that's important to remember that. So there's some inconsistent findings when it comes to what influences the frequency of use of force. And age and experience tend to be the two that are most important, but race and gender actually don't. So that's something to think about as well from those findings. The officer assignment, where you're assigned to, can really make a difference as well. If you think about it, if you're a police officer and you're assigned to a high crime area, an area with a lot of violence, then odds are you're going to need to use force a lot more than someone who's assigned to the rich, country club area, where there's not really much crime or violence or anything like that. Um, Also, most instances of use of force occur during an arrest. I think I mentioned before that there can be suspects who, are completely cooperative and everything, all the way up until the point that the officers want to make an arrest, and then they start fighting. Um, so, arrest is a big part of use of force. Um, so, that's something to keep in mind from your textbook as well. We don't talk a whole lot about the police culture in this class, but one of the things that leads to, problems with use of force is this kind of police culture of toughness. That the police are supposed to be tough and never back down and things like that. And this may lead to using force a little bit more often than probably needs to be. And so departmental leaders and people can also influence things. And they need to tell people, hey, look, you don't have to be so tough. You can be calm and you can back away if you need to. There was a video, and it was really unfortunate because they ended up shooting the guy anyway, from Athens, Georgia last year, where I'm pretty sure the guy had some mental health issues or something like that. But he had a big knife and he kept coming towards the officers, and the officers kept backing up, and they backed all the way down the street for quite some time. He was just walking towards them with the knife, and then towards the end, the guy started sprinting towards the officers with the knife, and then the officer, opened fire on him. And the officers were pleading with him the whole time, please put the knife down, we don't want to shoot you, and I thought that was very good. I think that, they handled that, I thought was a pretty good handling of that situation, and I believe that they really did want to shoot him. And they had one officer with the gun with lethal and one with the taser. And so after he'd been shot the first time, then he dropped the knife, so then they went to the taser, but that was ineffective. So you can watch that video if you want to, if you're into that kind of stuff. Anyway, so the control of police use of force, one of the things that you need to think about is organizational policies and rules. These things tend to govern use of force and need to be enforced. De-escalation techniques. This is a big one. And this gets into, this toughness and the culture of trying to be tough. That doesn't really go along with de-escalating things. And, trying to be the tough guy isn't going to de-escalate things. Trying to be calm and talk things out. There's a term called verbal judo, which, using people's words and their aggression against them, but doing so calmly and trying to de-escalate things, I think is a big step towards reducing violence and things like that. Young male officers tend to have, issues, especially young male officers who are assigned to high crime areas. If you're a young male officer assigned to a high crime area, you're going to have increased use of force, like I said, with the assignment of officers. Another thing to think about, too, is patterns of use of force. The Police Executive Research Forum has identified a few things, suggestions to dispatch a supervisor or multiple officers to high-risk calls. If you have multiple officers, it's less likely that you'll need to use lethal force. It's more likely that you'll be able to get someone under control using alternative means. And one thing to think about, too, is with that situation that I was describing, if you have a person with a knife, if you have multiple officers, you can have one officer with his sidearm, so that way the other officers can try to use a taser or use some other sort of less lethal means to get the person under control. But if those fail, you still have the officer there with the lethal force as a backup. One thing that officers will not do, and I don't think they should, is try to approach someone with a knife and try to get the knife away from them. You would want to, use some methods that would allow you to keep a distance between yourself and the person with the knife, such as the taser, or you could even pepper spray them. The pepper spray will go a good distance. You just want to make sure that you're not spraying it into the wind where you'll get, the other officers. Crisis intervention team, and these are people that are trained at dealing with people that are having a crisis. And a lot of times, like I said, a lot of these, use of force incidents that we see, whether they're justified or not, tend to involve people with either mental health issues or people that are under the influence of some sort of narcotic, and so they have what's called AMS, of altered mental status, and so that tends to be a big problem as well. Also, one thing on the police officer side is to identify trends in the use of force data, and to develop a system of early intervention. There have been instances where we have officers who have several use of force complaints, and then they end up with a brutality charge and end up killing someone. With access to data and an early intervention system, I think that some of these could actually be prevented by getting that officer off the street sooner. Someone with that many complaints is clearly having some sort of problem, and they need to be reassigned or let go or something like that. And finally, to understand objective reasonableness, I think, is an important thing to think about as well. And remember that officers are supposed to use the minimum amount of force necessary, to not be using excessive amounts of force. I like to talk about militarization of police, and there's this video in the North Hollywood shootout. And a lot of people think that militarization started after 9/11, but it really started a few years earlier than that with what's known as the North Hollywood shootout in Los Angeles. And this was at a Bank of America. When you can, at the Crime and Justice Museum in D.C., they used to have a makeup of the guys that robbed the bank, and they were completely covered in body armor. So the police were out there with machine guns. The bank robbers were. And the police were shooting at them, but most of the police officers, they either had 9mm or 38s. I think a couple of them had shotguns, but nothing that would penetrate this armor. And so several police officers, civilians, a lot of people got shot and killed during this instance because of the bank robbers. And the police even had vests, but they were, the suspects had rifles that could penetrate that, but the police couldn't penetrate anything that they had. But anyway, so this is just a mock-up of the Bank of America, and then you had all these police cars, and the robbers were essentially out here just shooting at everybody. And then they had the perimeter set up along the side over here. But anyway, so the robbers had full automatic rifles with armor-piercing ammo, body armor. And the police had 9mm, 38, 12 gauge, and a few had Kevlar vests. For those of you that don't know, Kevlar will not stop rifle rounds, especially with armor-piercing ammunition. In the end, the two robbers were both killed, but you ended up with 350 police officers shot. Deaths of police or civilians was actually kept to 0, but 6 civilians were wounded, and you had 550 rounds fired by the police, and then later on they got some ARs into the gunfight, patrol rifles. And this is all, they had a Beretta 92F, a Bushmaster, which is an M4, a Heckler & Colt 91, and a Norinco 56, which is an AK-47 variant. And so, the police were clearly outgunned in this match. And in the end, what they ended up doing was that the police actually went and they got an armored car. I don't know if it was from that bank or from a different bank, but they didn't have an armored car that they could get up close to them with. They didn't have, the APCs that you see the police with nowadays. And so then they went to the gun store. They went and got these rifles from the gun store. They went and got an armored car that you see that carries, the bank money around. and would use that to be able to get up closer to them and use the rifles to penetrate their body armor. And that's how they finally were able to succeed, because none of these three things had any stopping power for this stuff. And so this was one of the things that led to a lot of the changes in policing that you see nowadays. Even back then, the LAPD SWAT, they had an MP5. So even once the SWAT team got there, they had an MP5 is what they carried. And MP5 is a good close quarters weapon. It has a short barrel, but it fires a 9mm round, which would not penetrate. Oh, here's the picture of the mock-up at the museum, and this is what these guys were dressed all in. But anyway, so then even the SWAT team didn't have these or anything that could penetrate the body armor at the time. So this led to a lot of changes in policing. About 7 months later, you had 600 M16s that went from the Department of Defense, and they used M16s from the military that were then bought by the LAPD, and they were issued to the sergeants. They also authorized the street officers to start carrying a .45. Before that, only the SWAT team was authorized to carry a .45 caliber sidearm. The regular street cops had that Beretta 9mm. And then now you see all LAPD cars carry an AR-15, and that's actually quite prolific throughout the country. A lot of officers are now getting issued AR-15s, which they keep in their vehicle. LAPD actually has they're putting Kevlar plates in the doors of police cars now too, to give put a little bit of armor in the vehicle there for situations like this. While I'm on that topic, there is a common misconception. People think that all police cars have Kevlar plates and bulletproof glass and things like that. That is just not the case. The SWAT team and their APCs, APC is an armored personnel carrier, which is another thing that's actually being bought from the military as well. But those are bulletproof and stuff, but your regular patrol car is not bulletproof. To my knowledge, the LAPD is the only department that's even put in these Kevlar plates in the front two doors. But this is what really started that, along with the Waco shootout, which you can Google, the Waco shooting that involved the ATF storming the compound in Waco, and the Branch Davidians and all that kind of stuff, which happened around the same time. This is what really kind of started this whole militarization of the police in the United States. And so I think it's an interesting thing to bring in to the discussion when we talk about use of force, because this was an instance when the police were clearly outmatched and their force was not enough. So of course, this made the police departments and police officers want to beef up their amount of force that they had available to them. We can sit here and talk about, I guess in this instance it would be nice, or would have been better for them to have more use of force available, but in your regular day-to-day policing, maybe it might not be. I think, when you start issuing police officers, the AR-15s and things like that, you're blurring the line between military and police a lot. And police uniforms, if you look at them, have changed a lot. Cobb County PD is still pretty dressy with their uniform. They wear slacks and a button-up shirt. But if you compare Cobb County PD's patrol officer's uniform to the Marietta PD, they look totally different, right? The Marietta PD's got that overt carrier with all the pockets on it and everything. It very much look more like your regular officers, a member of the SWAT team. But it used to be that, officers would, wear more dressy uniforms, kind of like more similar to the Cobb County PD or even Georgia State Patrol. It wasn't uncommon, too, to see officers that wore a necktie. Interesting what, this is telling my age a little bit, because you all have probably never seen a police officer with a necktie. But it was never a real necktie. It was always a clip-on. For the reason, because, you don't want to get in a fight and be a police officer wearing a necktie. They'll just drag you around by it and everything. So anyway, On that note, I've talked for almost an hour here, so I think I'm gonna sign off and let you all marinate on all of this. So I hope you all have a good week. Please let me know if you have any questions or comments. And with that, I will talk to you next time. And have a good one.